born and brought up in Wolverhampton. My MP was Enoch Powell. And in fact, 1974 was a very strange year politically. We had 2 general elections in 1 year. And in the February election, I stood in Wolverhampton South West, which was Enoch Powell's constituency. And that was very much fired by my feelings about the Rivers of Blood speech and his attitude towards race and the future of our country in terms of immigration and community relations. And I suppose fundamentally I wanted to do something.
But you were so young.
I was young. I was too young to know I was too young.
How old were you?
When I was first selected, I was 22. And really, I was very doubtful as to whether I could do this, but it came from the local Labour Party in Wolverhampton. When I came down from Cambridge, I'd been president of the union, they knew I was a Labour Party member, they invited me to come and speak. And I talked to people afterwards, and there were a couple of great trade unionists there who said to me, I said, well, you know, I'm not sure I could be a good MP. And he said, there's only one way to be a good MP, that's to get elected. Go and do it. And they put me on the list of candidates.
And you were known as?
Helene Middleweek, that was my name.
And you were the baby of the house?
Ah, well, I was the baby of the house. I stood as Helene Middleweek in Wolverhampton in the February election, and I stood as Helene Middleweek for Welland and Hatfield when I got elected, and I got married in the meantime. Only year of my life I've ever lost weight without dieting. 2 general elections and getting married. And I decided I wanted to take my husband's name, which was not a very radical or feminist thing to do then. My agent just about lived with it because it fitted on the posters so much better, Helene Hayman.
It was difficult to get a seat for anybody, actually. When I was first elected, basically, if there was a photo call for all the women MPs, you only had to look round and you knew whether we were all there or not.
3%.
I hadn't worked that out, but yes, that makes sense. And there was a strong sense of camaraderie amongst us.
What most marks it out in my mind was actually the reason I went into Parliament in the first place, which is I was one of many women in the women's movement who decided that we were going to break into male-dominated areas, whether it was business, public services, the law, teaching, academia, whatever, journalism, all predominantly male-dominated, and obviously Parliament was male-dominated as well. And I was one of a group of women who was determined that we would, change that and ensure that women could have an equal place in all these in all these roles. And when I was first elected in 1982, I was one of only 3% women, and now there are 35% women. So really, our mission was to make Parliament more representative. And I think that over the 4 decades, we have done that, but we're still in a minority, outnumbered 2 to 1. So we've got a way to go, but we are very much a critical mass.
My first election was for Torrington West Devon in 1987, and it almost wrecked my marriage. A few days later, we sat at the breakfast table, and my husband, who was a big businessman, I mean enormously busy, working in a number of different continents and with many thousands and thousands of staff, he opened an envelope and it fluttered down to the floor from his nerveless fingers. And he said, Emma, I think you're going to have to leave this parliament. I don't think I can take this. I nearly fainted. I'd just been elected. I said, well, Michael, you helped me be elected. Thank you very much indeed. What are you talking about? No, Emma, I can't stand this. So I grasped the bit of paper from his fingers and looked at it, and it was a bit difficult. He was being asked to join the Conservative Women Parliamentary Wives. So I said, don't worry, darling, I'll tear it up. I think there must be something wrong. I think they think you're somewhere else. But it took a long time before we left the house comfortable to go to his work. So it almost wrecked my marriage. And the next thing that happened was that the television people got hold of me, and they collected myself and Kennedy, Charles Kennedy, who'd just been elected, and Paul Boateng. And very classic lineup, I suppose, one woman, one Scot with pale face and reddish fair hair, and one with clearly a different ethnic origin. And they lined us up and they said, you're reflective of the new parliament.
Was being a woman in Parliament an issue for you, or did you play it down?
It's so difficult to answer that because there's been so many changes since I got in 1987. Clearly there was just a small percentage of the House of Commons that were women. I think we had 19 Conservative women MPs, but some of them were such immense personalities and characters that we didn't feel understaffed, if I can put it that way. I mean, if you look at people, obviously like Mrs. Thatcher herself, but people like Jill Knight, Janet Fuchs, who is still very prominent in the House of Lords. These were huge personalities, physically very noticeable, and certainly able to defend themselves all round. So it didn't feel as if there were very few women around, but it is also true to say that the atmosphere, as I had expected it would be rather men's club or sometimes rugby dressing room, not that often, but you know, sometimes got like that a bit at night. I didn't feel isolated or particularly noticeable. And I didn't feel any prejudice, nor had I, in all the things I'd done before, which were numerous, any sort of prejudice about being a woman until I got to the Treasury.
I stood for Parliament in 1987. I met my husband at the Conservative Party conference the year of the Brighton bomb in 1984. He and I both stood in seats in 1987, and then he was elected in 92, by which time we were married and I had 2 small children. And I worked for him for about 10 years as PA before I made a brief dash to escape it, and the elastic band snapped me back. And obviously I've been there full time since I became a member of the House of Lords in 2011.
You set up a group called Women to Win. Why did you think it was needed?
Gosh, that's a big subject. That is a journey. I come from a political family and background. Both my mother's parents were MPs. And my grandmother was the 33rd ever woman MP, and her father, as a Liberal MP, had introduced the first women's suffrage bill in 1907 and subsequently went on to be a Labour peer. And he lived to see her become an MP in 1937. And so I had that in my background. But people often say to me, well, that must be the reason you got involved. And I don't think it was the case. I think that having been around Westminster for a long time, I could see that there weren't enough women MPs. I could see, Conservative in particular, all the political parties were bad at it until Tony Blair came in and introduced all-women shortlist in 1997, and then they leapt ahead.
It really did feel like being a bit of a pioneer, and of course it was very much, it felt like that for me, because when I arrived through the circumstance of a by-election, I happened to be pregnant when my predecessor died, and therefore I had to fight a by-election pregnant. So arriving young and pregnant in a male-dominated House of Commons, I immediately was not sort of one of the in crowd. I was very much a small out crowd, but an out crowd of one, really.
How did that demonstrate itself? Was there comments?
Sometimes people were outright hostile. I remember Nicholas Winterton, a Tory MP, or was it Tony Marlowe? It could have been either of them, shouting across the chamber that I was a stupid cow. You know, there was kind of outright misogynist. But above all, there was hostility to my agenda, because my quest was not just to be in Parliament, but to put on the agenda of Parliament issues of concern to women, like domestic violence, as Jo Richardson had done, like childcare. And I remember when I raised, in my first Prime Minister's questions to Margaret Thatcher, I raised the question of childcare as we're coming up to the school holidays. A lot of women are working. School holidays are very difficult. And I was saying, what's the government going to do about school holiday provision? And there was literally sort of jeering, not only from the other side, the Tory side, but from our side as well, on the basis that I really didn't know what being in Parliament was about. This was not an issue for Parliament. This was not an issue for government, you know, and therefore, why was I raising it? You know, I'd got the wrong end of the stick about being there. And in fact, there was an editorial in the Daily Mirror denouncing me for not knowing what questions I should be asking. So there was hostility to my agenda, which was the reason I was there. And this was really backed up, as I say, not just by fellow MPs, but by the media, who had the political lobby, which was more or less the exclusive reporting in Parliament at the time, because Parliament wasn't broadcast. They were all men as well, and they thought talking about issues of childcare or maternity was just silly and irrelevant, and it should be about the money supply and mining and not about those sorts of things.
When I got the job in the Treasury, which was when John Major became Prime Minister, and at the same time was made deputy to Chris Patten, deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, people began to feel they'd been competed against. And this was the first time I noticed comments from male MPs. However, this was as nothing compared with the welcome I got in the Treasury. The permanent secretary, who I believe is still alive, a man of enormous, overweening importance, of course, but he was only one of 4 or 5 Treasury Knights, as we called them, came into my office and said, yes, Mrs. Shepherd, you are the first woman Treasury Minister we've had. I want to explain to you how unimportant in the Treasury junior ministers are. Really, you're about signing things, and all of the policy, to be honest, is done with us, the senior officials, and the Chancellor. I hope you enjoy your time here. By the way, there is no women ministers' lavatory. So I said, I don't think that will worry me at all. I shall be very happy to use the women's Treasury staff lavatory. Should that worry me? At which he left the room. I must say, I've never forgotten, of course, one wouldn't. But, you know, how amazingly small-minded, I thought. How can you, a towering figure, possibly stoop to say something like that? How extraordinary. So I did find in the Treasury, for the first time, that sort of approach.
People have described it as very male. There weren't many women MPs at the time. What was the House of Commons like then, particularly being a young MP?
It was very male. I'm not sure if I felt intimidated, probably should have done. I felt patronised a lot of the time. And it was hugely male. 27 women MPs out of 635. Very few, certainly very few women with families, young women. The sort of model of a woman MP was very much the battle axe, you know, and it was very male. When I first went in, two things were said to me. One was I was told, you are now a member, this place is yours. You know, all those doors that are shut to everyone else, you can go through any door. So I was in there for about a week and I saw a door that said members only on it, and I walked in full of confidence and found myself facing a row of urinals because, you know, there were very few loos for women and members were men, so loos were said members.
And you had a family?
I didn't have a family then. I just got married. And my first son was born in October 1976.
And your story about feeding your baby?
Well, my story is not really about feeding my baby. My story is about not having any maternity leave. 1976, the summer of 1976, long hot summer. I was pregnant in that summer. And that was when Michael Heseltine waved the mace and all pairing was stopped. So there was no opportunity for that. I once went home because Barbara Castle created such a fuss that Margaret Thatcher paired with me, and the only time I ever really had a conversation with her. It was very, very difficult. And by the spillover time, when Ben was born, nothing had been resolved. The government was on a complete knife edge. We were winning votes by 1 or 2, 3, mainly on House of Lords amendments that came back on controversial legislation. And there I was with a newborn baby. I wrote to Margaret Thatcher actually and said, listen, please, you know, pair me, and then at least one of your sick people didn't come in, because terrible things were happening. People were dying because they were being brought in and brought down from Liverpool, and you know, they were in ambulances in New Palace Yard being nodded through for votes. It was a horrible time, but they wouldn't pair me. So, you know, I either had to leave a child I was breastfeeding at home and abandon him, or I had to abandon my party, and that seemed stupid to me. So I picked up the baby and I came to Parliament. But that was not because I was trying to make any great statement. It was about the fact that no one recognised that it would be a sensible thing to allow someone who'd had a baby to have a few weeks off before they came back to work.
And Jo Swinson, many years, decades later, went through a similar thing, didn't she? You didn't breastfeed in the chamber, but it, you know, it can still be taboo.
Yes, I think much less so. I mean, when I look at the number of women ministers who have had time off to have babies, the number of women parliamentarians, the fact that the Commons now, allows small babies to be carried through the lobbies. I was told, I mean, no provision was made whatsoever. I was once reported to the police by a fellow parliamentarian for having the baby in one of the lady members' rooms because he was a stranger, 3 weeks old,
Your own party, or?
Oh, no, not my own party. Very senior, a woman minister, ex-minister. But no arrangements were made. The only thing I was ever told they had discussed, because the chief doorkeeper told me, was that if ever I tried to bring the baby into the chamber, how much force he was entitled to use to stop me entering the chamber.
In the constituency, of course, it was tremendous fun because it was one of Britain's biggest farming constituencies and family farmers, and so enormous amount of work to do. And that actually led me to Brussels because the farmers asked me a whole load of questions, and however much I put them forward in parliamentary question time, and then I got myself to work in the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food as a parliamentary PPS for the minister, there were no answers here. None. And that was because everything was decided in Brussels because of the common agricultural policy. And that was quite shocking for me. One of my grandfathers was an agriculture minister at one point. This isn't right. So that's partly why I got myself to Brussels, in order to try to disentangle this, poor family farmers in Devon, not being able to get an answer from their minister here as to what were the ingredients of the cattle fodder that was being brought in from South America. So I got myself to Brussels and we got that sorted. All animal feed stuff now has to be fully labelled with all ingredients. And if I'd managed to get there 20 years earlier, we wouldn't have had the brain disease because that came from that cattle fodder. It was cows eating cows, and the farmers didn't know that. So it was a huge experience, and that led me to Brussels. And there I was able to help the Devon farmers.
In 1997, when Theresa May and Eleanor Lang, for example, were both elected, we had, I think, 17 Conservative women MPs. Okay, it was a year of a massive landslide for Labour, but they at the same time had 101. So if you can visualise the 17 on our side and the 101 on the Labour side, it illustrates the problem quite clearly. I think I got steamed up about it a little bit later on. The 2005 general election, we'd made no progress basically between that period where we were at 9% of the parliamentary party. Women made up 9%, or as I prefer to say it, men made up 91%. And before the 2005 election, there had been an incident, and I don't remember the details, but 2 women were deselected in the run-up to the election. And I believe it was something to do with wearing a skirt that was either too short or not short enough. And somebody asked me, I don't remember quite how the journey started, but somebody asked me about why I thought this was happening. And I gave a quote to the press. And then I was in the cuttings, and you will understand that then meant that you were an expert of some kind. After the election in 2005, where we made no progress, I wrote an article for, I think, the Sunday Times on the process of selection and how it mitigated against women at the time, because it was a very traditional, you had to give a speech, stand up in front of the selectorate, which was Conservative members, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today. And it was a quite sort of intimidating experience. So I started to think about how the process could be fairer for women. And in this article, I talked to a few candidates in advance, and I suggested that we should be using what subsequently became the A list or the gold list or the priority list, but where the actual candidates list was whittled down to a much smaller number. I think in the end it was 100, so 50 men and 50 women, and the selectorate, our Conservative members, were expected to pick from those top candidates rather than the 600 or however many it was that were on the candidates list.
You then in 2006 became the Foreign Secretary, the first woman, as we've said, to hold that post. And then when Gordon Brown got in, you were dropped, but managed to come back as Housing Minister. And don't forget you were at the Environment for a long time and agriculture as well. But in all that time, did you suffer sexism, particularly perhaps as Foreign Secretary?
I experienced it. I wouldn't necessarily say I suffered it. I mean, it was clear that somebody I'd worked with, was quite a senior position in the Foreign Office, had said to me shortly after I became Foreign Secretary, you do realise there are people in the Foreign Office who don't think a woman should be Foreign Secretary. And I hadn't thought about it particularly, but I said, well, I'm sorry if that's the case, but I regard that as their problem, which I did. And so, yes, there was... I used to say to people when Boris was Foreign Secretary that I always felt the Foreign Office thought that they knew what the Foreign Secretary should be, and it should be a man who'd been to the right kind of school, the right kind of university, and preferably had a reputation as a bit of an intellectual. And now they've got one of those, which I must admit usually produced mirth.
And were you disappointed that you didn't keep that role?
Yes, very disappointed. I hadn't expected to keep it necessarily for, a very long time, but I would have liked another year. Apart from anything else, I'm from Ernie Bevan's union. I was conscious of how Ernie Bevan was thought to have done a very good job for the Foreign Office, and I would have liked to follow in his footsteps for a little longer.
I think, for me, I am enormously proud of having served in both houses, having been a minister, having been speaker. I'm a grammar school girl from Wolverhampton. I'm very, very lucky to have been able to do all that.
Apart from Margaret Thatcher, two high-standing ministerial Secretary of State roles. I mean, your name ranks after Margaret Thatcher's, who was Prime Minister.
Well, I'd forgotten, but now I think about it, yes, when I became Shadow Chief Secretary, she was the only other woman who I think then had been Shadow Chief Secretary. And I suppose perhaps I was the second to hold one of the great offices of state. So, yes, I have been fortunate. You'll find I do quote Leo a fair bit. One of his observations was that if you're hard-working and you're good at what you do, you will always be useful to a Prime Minister.
You say the minimum wage was a significant achievement because other people claim credit for it.
Everybody claims credit for it. As it happens, I had a friend on the administrative side in Number 10, and I can't remember how long it was after. It must have been more than a year, I think, but who happened to come across the fact that a reception was planned to celebrate an anniversary of the introduction of the minimum wage, and saw the names and sort of said, oh, but what about Margaret Beckett and Ian McCartney? Because Ian McCartney did all the work. He did the background research and so on, and did the donkey work. And neither he nor I were on the list, nor, as far as she could see, was anybody who'd actually served on the committee or anything like that. It was kind of the great and the good, but not the great and the good who'd had anything to do with introducing the minimum wage. The end result, of course, was the reception was cancelled. Not that we were invited. But, so, yes, I think... and I remember my driver telling me that they had a family friend, a woman in low-paid work, and I think her income had gone up by something like £100 a month when the minimum wage came in.
I think one of the things that I'm really glad we achieved right at the end of the Labour government, and in fact, it was the last bill passed into law by the Labour government in 2010, was the Equality Act. And it was the last line of the 2005 manifesto. and the last Act of Parliament passed in 2010, which was as I say, the Equality Act. But what I've been very pleased and gratified about is it's really stood the test of time, is that it hasn't been repealed by successive Conservative leaders, and it is still protecting people and advancing rights in the duties it gives public authorities to promote equality and the defence it gives people to be protected against discrimination, whether it's on disability or sexual orientation or race or age or gender. So I think that Act, the Equality Act, feels very important to me to have led that through. But we just got it in by a whisker. It nearly didn't happen. So many of my Secretary of State colleagues were objecting to different things in it. And it wasn't until I said to Gordon Brown, you've got to back me on this or I'm not going to get it through. And he literally got the Cabinet Secretary to sort of signal to all the government departments, all the objections have got to be dropped, and the bill had to go through.
And it did, and was yet another of your triumphs. And finally, which Prime Minister did you enjoy working with most?
Well, I've only really worked with two Prime Ministers, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and they were both, I would say, political giants of their generation. I think that I was more comfortable working with Tony Blair as Prime Minister and Gordon Brown as Chancellor. I think that Gordon Brown had a very torrid time as Prime Minister at the end of the Labour years and with the global financial crisis.
I began the Stop Polio campaign against a mass of opposition. People simply couldn't see the point. I don't know why. And the senior doctor who picked it up and took it to Geneva and then ran it, when I met him later, when he was plump and happy, having nearly covered the whole globe with anti-polio, he said, this is probably the best thing you've ever done, don't bother to do anything else ever, which was very nice. So perhaps he was right. I mean, polio is a vile disease, and the awfulness of people dragging their legs behind them for the rest of their lives, which everybody's now forgotten miraculously, that's because of immunisation. I think the saddest moment of my life was when the biggest marshland and most ancient marshland in the globe is in the south of Iraq, or was in the south of Iraq and Iran. And that was the Mesopotamian marshlands where all of our culture began, reading, writing, the law and everything. And Saddam started to drain it. And I went to Douglas Hurd, and Douglas understood, of course, and he spent a whole weekend on the telephone trying to persuade the French and the Americans to stop it. I'd given them all the data, I knew everything, I'd been there, and I'd seen it, and I came back with the information, and I made speeches in the House of Commons. And to Douglas's heartbreak, he failed to persuade the Americans. The American General Schwarzkopf, who was the one in charge at that time, said, don't allow this, he said to the President of America, because otherwise I'm going to have to find my men, my troops, fighting Iranians there, and we can't do that. We're not ready to do that. And that's why they didn't do it. As a result, the largest and most important wetland of the whole globe was almost 100% destroyed. That was my incredible sadness.
When I started there, the place was full of, World War II veterans, a very different type of MP. And I mean, until like any campaign, until you start campaigning on it, you're like, well, could somebody else deal with this? And in fact, for years, I thought, when is somebody going to do something about the women? And eventually I stopped looking over my shoulder, looked in the mirror, and thought, okay, I will get stuck into this as an issue. And of course, the answer is I feel very proud of what we've achieved. Of course, there is more to do. And I doubt that, I'm hoping that I shall be pushed in my wheelchair into the gallery to watch generations to come making their maiden speeches. And I will continue to be very proud of any of those who step up to start the journey, and particularly those who finish the journey. And incidentally, I mean, at the last Conservative Party leadership, I think I'm right of saying the final 8, 4 were women, and although we're disproportionate, we're still only 25%. and indeed looking to any future potential Conservative leadership campaign, it looks as though that will be absolutely dominated by women.
What was your proudest achievement?
Oh dear. I will tell you what it was, but it is bizarre. It was when we were in opposition. I think I must have been in the Lords by then. And in my constituency of South West Norfolk, we suddenly found that we had got hundreds of migrant workers, and we felt that many of them must be illegal. They were said, some of them, to come from South America, and they spoke Portuguese. We assumed this was the case, and there was a lot of employment by gangmasters and others in that sort of agricultural work and other work. And it was obvious there was abuse. There were 2 house fires in Norfolk at that time. One was in my constituency, and 38 people were found to have been living in the house, and there was a similar event in King's Lynn. And it was absolutely obvious that bad things were going on. So we tried to introduce a private member's bill to examine the whole issue of gang labour. And the Labour government were not having this. And then a Labour member, Jim Sheridan of Scott, got another private member's bill opportunity, and he decided to tackle this. And with the help of Nick Brown and Frank Dobson, both Labour cabinet ministers or former cabinet ministers, we got ourselves onto the private bill committee, and we forced the Labour government to introduce the Gangmasters Act. Now, we didn't succeed in this on our own, because when we were just at the last stages of pushing it, and with Labour resisting, including John Prescott, the terrible events of Morecambe Bay occurred, with all those Chinese people, cockle pickers, dying on their phones to their relatives in China because there was no one to ring in Britain. And out of shame, the Labour government then had to accept it, and it was the Gangmasters Act, and it was the first blow against modern slavery. I'm very proud of that, but it's interesting that it should be a thing that I did from opposition and from the Lords. Weird.
You've had a stellar career, and why didn't you go for the leadership? What was holding you back?
Well, I think people don't necessarily remember, but that I was always under a lot of criticism, because for all the advances that women's have made, there was a big backlash. And for all that you kind of... So there was a lot of hostility to my agenda, and I was always getting a hammering in the newspapers. If ever I did anything wrong, and you know, everybody makes mistakes, they would be down on me like a ton of bricks. So I was kind of a controversial figure rather than a kind of overarching figure. And that was in my head, that I didn't have enough breadth of support to lead the Labour Party into government. I ran for deputy leader because I thought we cannot possibly have a men-only deputy leadership contest, which looked like we were going to have. So I put my hat in the ring because I thought this is absolutely ridiculous. This is like saying to women in the Labour Party there are no women suitable even to run for deputy, and surprised everybody by winning by an actual whisker. But that was literally, I think it was like 50.3% of the vote. And I think that I felt you needed to have more widespread support than I had. And also, I'd just been battered for so many years that the idea of becoming leader, where you actually it's the only thing you can do. If you're a leader of a party, let alone if you're Prime Minister, that is the only thing you can do. It's the only thing you can be, the leader of your party. And I was also a mother of 3 children. And I think I wasn't prepared to do the amount of personal sacrifice that actually top leadership of the party does require.
Do you regret that now?
I think I actually would have been I'm quite confident I would have won if I had have run, because David Miliband didn't win, and I think I would have beaten Ed Miliband. So I think that would have been nice to have won it, but whether or not I would have done a good job, who knows? It's much harder than it looks being leader of the Labour Party. So no, I don't regret it. But I do regret not insisting on being Deputy Prime Minister.
In our early years, the number of male collections vastly outnumbered the female, and that's something going forward we're very keen to put right.
And you are actually also collecting some of the Labour women of 97.
Yes, so at the moment, in part, thanks to you and this project, we are deliberately reaching out and trying to diversify our collections and to bring in the papers of more female politicians. I think it's vitally important that if this is an archive that reflects public policy, government, that it reflects the changes that have taken place over time. And one of those key changes, of course, is the increase in the number of women. And that needs to be reflected in our holdings.
And you have Tessa Jowell?
Yes, so we have recently taken in the papers of Patricia Hewitt, of Tessa Jowell, on the other side of the aisle of Baroness Trumpington, and we're at the moment engaging with a number of female parliamentarians in the hope that we can get them to also add their papers here and to think about their archive.
I'm really worried about the impact of social media, particularly on women. I don't know how I would have managed to cope with that. My young colleagues in the House of Commons have different approaches. One reads everything and one reads nothing. But, it really, does it have to come to this when we were trying to make progress? And so much of it is anti-women in the worst possible sense of the word. So I think that is a big step backwards, I'm sorry to say. And all in the name of progress and free speech and everything else. We've had a murder, after all, of a woman. She was in the pursuit of her duty at the time. Grotesque. That's not progress, but that affects society as a whole, and not just women in politics.
So you still think you're batting at the same wicket, to use a male metaphor?
Oh, it's a different wicket. This is what is so difficult about progress. It's forward and back, sideways, slide, and so on. And you think that you have helped to create all these opportunities for women. You look at fantastic women at the top of professions. You look at the recognition of women. You look at what's happening in the entertainment industry, and then you find that something new, namely social media, is pecking away at the foundations of what you thought you had helped to build in, frankly, a gross way.
My suggestion is don't bother with social media. It doesn't get you votes. What gets you votes, as all the surveys and all the data shows, what gets you votes is going out and talking face to face with your electorate. They fuss too much about social media, just leave it alone. I just block out anybody who I think is abusive or nasty. I use Twitter, it's most amusing, I have rather fun, but block it out. I think they've been misled in thinking that social media is an electoral tool. All the surveys, if people read these things properly, tell you that the only way to change somebody's vote or to to actually talk to them about what's going on is on the doorstep. That's the key, face to face. I've been elected by a whole load of people. I mean, I think the last election was about 500,000 or something, or 1 million, but it was European Parliament. But I've often said to people, look, you don't agree with me, why are you going to vote for me? Which is true, many people have voted for me who didn't agree with anything I said. I always got the same answer back again, amusingly. I thought it was good to find out. And they all said, because you tell us the truth. Even when you don't agree with us, even when you don't agree with what the truth is, you always tell us reality is what is really going on, and we value that.
Is it tougher for women in politics today because of social media?
I think it's much tougher. I think even though we were in a tiny minority, and as I say, you were patronised or people treated you as a silly woman or whatever. So, and it was more so for me because I was both young and female. We didn't have the abuse, we didn't have the death threats, you know, it was nothing like that. I have sons rather than daughters, so I've never had to face it in my own family, but if I think of my daughters-in-law, I would, you know, I believe passionately in public service, I believe passionately in Parliament. I think it's, you know, again, it sounds trite, but protecting our parliamentary democracy, making it work is so important, and women should absolutely be part of that. On the other hand, I don't want to see people's lives really stunted and harmed by their participation. And somehow, and this is not just MPs, you know, this is anyone who gets into any sort of public eye, and I think we have as a society gone really quite mad and very horrible.
I would do it again today because, as I always say to school pupils if they ask me, unless you're born to wealth and power, there are very few ways in which you can influence the world around you. And, you know, perhaps you can to a degree if you're in one of the caring professions. But as I said at the outset, you can only do what the world of politics will allow you to do.
There is all those issues of privacy as well, which are a challenge. But I would still encourage people to do it because we need, you know, women in there to make the changes that need to happen. And it is a great privilege to do.
And social media is another off-putting factor because women seem to suffer even more abuse on social media than all MPs seem to suffer it, and people in public life, councillors as well. But women seem to suffer it more, and that could be another factor and safety of MPs to put young women off.
Well, I think it's a paradox about social media because social media allows women to connect together. You know, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or whatever platform, women are talking to each other directly and working together and organising together and campaigning together and collaborating. And they don't have to do it through the medium of male-dominated structures. So, like, I can communicate with my constituents just like that. I don't have to go through the male editor of the South London Press or the Southwark News. And so actually social media has been very liberating for women, but the downside of it is it's been an opportunity for death threats, rape threats, attempts to silence women, and it's particularly virulent in relation to young women and especially young black women. You know, there is a sort of racist, misogynist cadre out there who wants to threaten women into silence. So that's why there's rape threats and death threats. They're purposeful to try and shut women up. And that's why I've argued that there should be this thing called a speakers conference where we get the tech companies in, as well as the security people, as well as discussions about where the right to freedom of speech ends and where it becomes harassment and intimidation. And I think we need a sort of new settlement around what is the rough and tumble that MPs have to be expected to put up with and what is crossing over the line.
You're a serious politician, you're a serious woman, but you've been accused of being no fun. What do you say to that?
Well, do you know, I don't care about whether I'm fun or not, because my job is not to be having fun or giving people fun. It's to actually be trying to get change.
There are additional risks that we didn't have when we started out, and that, of course, is the publicity, the being in social media, being in the public eye, misspeaking. You know, if you say something that is considered controversial, then you get a pile-on and so on. I mean, a lot of women say to me, "I want to give back," and I, generally speaking, don't think giving back is enough, because there are other ways to give back to your community. You know, you could chair your parish council or whatever. It does take more than that, and particularly if you want to play a significant role on the national stage. But there are, you know, we've got enough of those women. We just need to go and look for them, and they are probably campaigners already out there.
What people are going to want, and what we hopefully provide in the archive here, is the personal papers and the personal voices to accompany the official records. It doesn't rely in individual documents. It doesn't rely so much in the papers of individuals. Where it really lies is in the ability of researchers to come to the Churchill Archive Centre, to study modern policy, history, society, and to do it through a number of different complementary perspectives. And it's absolutely vital that the women's voices are heard as part of that, and that, to quote your own phrase, Bonnie, that the women are in the room.
When I was elected, there were only 23 women in Parliament out of 650. So it's extraordinary, for less than 5%. And so on it went. There were very, very few women around. Now, in some ways, that gave you an advantage, because they wanted you to be on any questions or on question time. You know, the men got quite jealous because the women, as it is today, got more invitations. When I got to the cabinet, I was the 9th woman in the British cabinet, and I thought, wow, you know, that's quite something, and it's a great honour and a privilege. And you look back over history and think, that's fantastic. Now, the two other things about Mrs. T, that why didn't she have imposter syndrome? So my theory, social scientist, is that she was brought up as the oldest son, so that's very important. Her father was very proud of her. She was a Methodist, which is quite a dogmatic faith. I'm an Anglican, which is more like the Tory party. People don't really mind what you believe, and certainly wouldn't ask what you believe, so long as you don't frighten the horses. And she was a scientist, so she was very logical. But it is very remarkable that she had this sort of drive and confidence. And so I liked her. But I can't say I wasn't intimate with her, but when I lost the Isle of Wight, so she came the day before my election in the Isle of Wight, where I got nearly 35,000 votes and lost. So only 5 people in the country got more votes than me, but one of them beat me. And the day before, she came down to Newport, and she arrived on the beach in Cowes in a hovercraft, sort of mimicking taking the Falklands. And Carol Thatcher writes about this beautifully. And she was tremendous, so off we went. And then I lost, which was terrible. So the following day, she's just won the election. And, you know, her first election, she actually won as Prime Minister, and she's forming her cabinet. And then she telephoned me and said, "Oh, Virginia, I'm so sorry, what happened?" Now, this was too much for me. I'd been a good loser. I'd had to do an interview on Woman's Hour. I'd put up with them. Peter had postcards printed saying, "Virginia Bottomley, MP for the Isle of Wight." All disaster, but I was officer-like. Mrs. T reduced me to tears. I went off in floods of tears. Because, you know, she did have that ability to really reach out to people when they were, you know, really low.
I was elected in 1987, and I come from the northeast of England. I was never going to go away from the northeast, as it were. And there were 3 of us elected, 3 women elected, about 26 MPs, 3 of whom were women, and we'd not had any women since Ellen Wilkinson in Labour. And Ellen, of course, died in the 45 Attlee government. So there we were in 1987, a good 20 years later, and we were the only 3. And before we were elected, we knew each other well and talked to each other, and we all had issues about being the only woman. I remember very well that I was secretary of the local Labour Party in Sunderland before I went back to west of Durham. And in Sunderland, the chair of the constituency was an old councillor who just used to say, "But women don't want to be members of parliament. That's why we don't have any. They don't, they're too busy doing other things."
It was a pretty hostile environment, actually. It felt more like a boys' public school than almost anything else. I mean, there was tobacco smoke everywhere. That was one of the things I remembered, because I suffered slightly from asthma, so tobacco smoke I always found extremely irritating. But almost everywhere you went, there was the smell of tobacco smoke. There were only 30 women MPs, I think, when I got elected in '92. I mean, one of the things that is worth saying is that I had not in my professional life worked very much with other women before, because I'm a mathematician and a scientist. I had been mainly working with men. And what really took me aback was the warmth and friendship I had from some of the senior Labour women. People like Harriet Harman, Anne Taylor, Margaret Beckett, who were just absolutely wonderful and really nice and helpful and, supported me in those early days. So it's one of the outstanding memories.
You were often singled out as a woman. I think you sat on the Science and Technology Select Committee. You were a statistician.
Yeah.
You did a mathematics degree.
Yeah.
And here you were, a woman, but a woman who was numerate and who was a scientist in Westminster.
Yes.
That was an oddity.
It was an oddity, and I decided to try and turn that to an advantage in representing scientists much more than they had been previously in the House of Commons.
It was a tough election because it was a Conservative-held seat, and it was a strange seat because the Conservatives were thought to be losing it, but it was the Liberal Democrats that was anticipated would win it. So it was a 3-way marginal, and really, really hard work, tough work. Put it this way, when the Labour Party had the selection conference for the candidate in Yardley, there weren't hundreds queuing up to take it on. And if I'm really honest with you, I wouldn't have got a Birmingham seat that was safer than Birmingham Yardley. So it was a tough thing from the start, but I very much enjoyed it. And we only won by 162. So that was hard work, and every election was hard work because it was a Liberal Democrat challenge rather than a Conservative challenge in the subsequent elections. When I got to the House of Commons, I think I had an advantage because my dad had been an MP. So it wasn't the first time in the building. And I loved politics, but I loved my dad being an MP and him being able to tell me what it was like. I loved going round with him and attending meetings. So it wasn't a strange place. And I do think that all that helped. So I didn't get there and have the feeling that, gosh, I don't fit in or I don't like this place when I'm here. I didn't have those barriers to overcome. But one thing I did notice
was that when the new Labour MPs got together, so this would be 92, we were a reasonable sized group actually. It wasn't as big as 97 in terms of Labour women, but it was a reasonable sized group. I went round meeting everybody, and it was amazing how many of us had won seats from the Tories. So it wasn't just me that had come in having won a marginal seat. We'd almost all, not absolutely all, but almost all had marginal seat wins in that 92 election. And when you look further in the Parliamentary Labour Party and see who'd come in on the basis of having won a safe seat, they were men, not women.
I was elected as MP for Barking in 1994. It was a by-election. My predecessor was Jo Richardson, who'd been a strong feminist campaigner all her life, and she died. Barking Labour Party was very, very different in those days. Is that the question you're asking me? Barking Labour Party was very different in those days. I always tell very funny stories about this election because I had actually given up politics in 1992. I'd been through too many losses. You know, we'd lost 79, 83, 87, 92. I'd been a local authority council member. I'd been leader of a council. I'd led for Labour in London, and I'd had enough. So I tried to give up. And I also went and worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers as a public sector consultant. But I always had my eye on Barking because it's not very far from where I live. And I knew the leader of the council. So when she died, he rang me up and said, "You've got to stand." But I knew nobody in the party. And it was a very small, inward-looking party, very dominated by the trade unions. Ford's was still quite big in those days. So it was the people from Ford's, male-dominated, very white, very middle-aged. And basically, I got the list of party members, and I had to. It was the first time that one member, one vote was used for selecting candidates for election. John Smith had just introduced that change, and there was a favoured son locally who had been working in the constituency forever. I knew nobody, but he didn't really understand the changes in the electoral system. Prior to one member, one vote, basically, as long as you've got a lot of union nominations and you've got the delegates to the general committee supporting you, you secured the nomination. So he got endless union nominations, whereas I got quite a lot of ward nominations, but I went knocking door to door to door because I knew every single vote counted. And I have got some very funny stories. So didn't know anybody, had this list, so I thought I'll start with the secretaries of the local party. Knocked on this one woman's door. She let me in and she said, "When's your birthday?" So I said, "September the 8th. So she said, "Oh, you're a Virgo, I'll vote for you."
It was a shock to the system. Nobody in my family had ever been a parliamentarian, and the way of working is very different from anything else that I'd experienced. I mean, it's not 9 to 5. I'd had full-time jobs, I'd had part-time jobs, but I think it's a very different style of working. And quite often I had to explain to my constituents that about half the time is spent in the constituency and the other 50% of the time is spent at Westminster. So Monday to Thursday at Westminster, Thursday to Monday back in the constituency. And, you know, very, very long hours culture in Westminster. And it took some adjusting to the very late nights, particularly as I had small children. And so, you know, late nights plus early starts with small children can make you quite tired. But adjusting to the pattern of working took a little while.
Now, you came in to Parliament at a famous Labour victory. Tell me what that felt like, because there were more women in Parliament, although you'd stood in 92 and hadn't won a seat then. But but the Conservatives have been defeated.
So I think a very good description was given to me by one of my male colleagues, who said it was how he imagined the aftermath of the First World War, you know, when so many people had been lost in battle, that, you know, it was a regrouping of the remnant of the army at Westminster. That's how he described it. Obviously, I hadn't known what it was like in the previous parliamentary cycles when there were more Conservative MPs, but Labour did have a bigger majority than even we had Conservative MPs. So pretty quickly, it was obvious to me that people like myself, women and men for that matter, with young families, they were predominantly on the Labour benches, and I gravitated a bit towards them, just talking through the practicalities of, you know, how you adjust to the working style of Parliament. But I also had some older colleagues on the Conservative benches who were very helpful in terms of helping me understand what I might expect. For the first 6 weeks, we didn't have a chief whip at all. The chief whip had resigned, and so we had a handful of very new Conservative members of Parliament. We had to sort of help ourselves to understand what was going on. And I do remember one of the early occasions, we were sitting in the chamber on one of the very first occasions, and suddenly people were standing up. So, you know, we stood up, and then one of us realised that people were standing up in order to be called to speak, and we weren't ready to speak. So he said, "Sit down." So we all sat down. So there were some very basic things we had to learn in those early weeks, a lot of them.
I contacted all local political parties, and only one came back to me. The Liberal Democrats knocked on my door. And I had had a sense that that's where I was going to be in politics. I'm very, focused on community activism. I've always had a very strong environmental streak, which I'd exercised while I was in the United States. I'm very internationalist in my outlook, believe strongly in social justice and civil rights. And it seemed to me the party where I would likely belong. But the person on my doorstep said, "You're new to the area. We're having a ward meeting on Friday. Why don't you come down and meet some people?" I went, and by the end of Friday afternoon, I was the social secretary of the Barnes Ward Liberal Democrats. And it went from there. I met other people. I ended up going to a party conference, which I found unbelievably invigorating and exciting. And women Liberal Democrats, who were then a very active group, persuaded me to fill out the forms to become a prospective parliamentary candidate. And as I filled them out, I was sitting next to somebody I met for the first time called Lynn Featherstone, also filling out her forms. And the two of us came into Parliament together in 2005.
There's a cloakroom that, as you come in, off the square, Parliament Square, that bit of it, there's a cloakroom there, and there are little pink ribbons on every hanger, and I think, oh, what's all that about? Is that sort of welcoming women? Actually, they're a historic traditional legacy, and they're there so that the men could hang their swords on the ribbons before they entered the house. So that was my sort of feminist take. Tessa Giles, who's sadly not with us anymore, she came in a couple of years before me, but she used to say there are more MPs in Parliament whose first name is John than there are women MPs. So one of the great changes is having so many women now in Parliament.
Was it the greatest change when 101 Labour women were elected in 1997? Did that make a difference?
Let me say good and bad things. I think all women, the positive action, the all women's shortlist was absolutely central in bringing more women into Parliament. And before anybody says that brought in women of a lesser calibre and capability, that is such rubbish. We have the most fantastically talented women who came in that way. And the interesting thing is, in every constituency where there wasn't an all women's shortlist, invariably they selected a man. So it was, I think it's a really effective tool, and it helped us grow. The sad thing is that this time round, we'll have to see, we're now talking 2024, and Labour can no longer use all women's shortlist because it was challenged legally when we first brought it in. And the judgment was that until such time as we get to 50%, it's a legitimate tool. Once you get beyond 50%, it would become an unlawful tool. So we're at 50.02% or something like that. We've just got within the Labour Party, so we weren't able to use it. And I am very nervous that the proportion of women Labour MPs next time will not be at the 50% we achieved this time, because if you're just watching those selections, so it was good more women were there. I absolutely hated that photograph of Tony Blair with the Blair's babes. I thought that was a deeply offensive image of who we were, you know, standing behind Tony. I love Tony Blair, but standing behind him in that way, I thought was not a welcome way of celebrating the fact that there were over 100 women MPs. Did we make a difference? 100%. 100% difference. And I tell you, it's sort of, we worked together. We made a difference in so many ways. We worked together. We're much more collaborative and much less competitive and much more supportive of each other. That's in the nature of women's DNA, really. We cared about issues that matter for women. So, you know, you'd never have had the childcare strategy. You'd never have had Sure Start. You'd have never have had the domestic violence, the improvement in maternity leave and maternity pay.
We had nothing of that. That's not to say it might not have been going on. It might have been going on. But I have to say that was never, ever brought to my attention. And I didn't experience anything that I couldn't handle, if you see what I mean. I mean, I remember very well, Mo Molam and I shared a flat, shared my dad's old flat for about the first 18 months, and we shared an office. And Mo was outrageous on occasions. And one of our colleagues from Durham got very upset with her swearing. So we'd walked in from the flat one morning and gone into the tea room for a breakfast, and this member was there. And she said to him, "It's all right, I promise you I won't swear as long as you listen to the problems I'm having with my period." I've never seen anybody move as quickly out of the tea room. So, you know, if you like, that sort of attitude meant that she never had problems with the men, because they knew she would come back at them. And they sort of did with me too.
Being called Blair Babes was a bit of a put down, I must say. You know, I didn't think of myself as a babe. I mean, I was 57 by that stage, so I'd had a lot of experience under my belt. And yeah, I felt it didn't portray the force that we clearly were. One of the things that I did try to change was the importance of science to the economy. And the person who listened to me after we got into government was Gordon Brown, who took it up in a wonderful way. But at that time, the real concern of most Labour MPs was the decline of the shipping yards, the motor manufacturing, you know, the old manufacturing industries which had sustained the northern towns, the mining, which of course was going as well. And it was slightly irritating to have this newcomer from Cambridge standing up and saying, we've got all this wonderful high-tech stuff which is going to save the world eventually. So, you know, it was a bit of a struggle sometimes, I have to say.
One of the things I felt that I did okay was that I think I communicated with people reasonably well. I really, really tried hard. It was really, really, really important to me that I listened. But that comes from being a teacher. You know, that it's a teacher's skill, getting feedback from children. So when I talk to teachers or when I talk, I really, really try to listen hard. And I think there's a type, if you listen hard, it's no good listening unless you respond to what you've heard. And I wanted to think that that's what I was good at. And I think I was reasonably good at that. I know a lot of politicians who are not good listeners. They're good talkers, but they're not good listeners, and I could name them. And a lot of those are men. And if you listen well and take it in to feed it back, I think it makes you a bit hypersensitive to everything you hear. And so I think I probably was a bit thin-skinned. I know I was thin-skinned. But if I'd have been, and I remember thinking this at the time, if I'd have become thick-skinned, I wouldn't have been the sort of politician I wanted to be. I would have stopped hearing and responding. So the next time I would have gone to teachers and they said, we think you're doing wrong, I would have said, shucked it off. I would have said, well, that's the way it is, I'm Secretary of State. Would have gone back to the office and we'd have got onto it. We'd have got on with it. I didn't want to be that. I really didn't want to be like that. And I got myself, I really persuaded, I didn't persuade myself, but I really fought against throwing things off because I thought a change in politics meant that we wouldn't do that, but we would continue to engage. I think the problem with the A-levels, this was something I wasn't good at and a weakness, is when I didn't understand the logic of the argument, I didn't know what to do. I'd engaged, I'd done the chatting, I thought I'd solved it, and I woke up every morning to the headlines still being there. And I no longer knew how to deal with that. I no longer had a skill set that meant I could get through that day still feeling reasonably happy in my own skin at the end of the day. And that was a problem for me. And I know that what I should have done was ignore the headlines, throw it off, and said to myself, if you think you've dealt with it, you've dealt with it, put the rest to one side. And it's that bit that I couldn't do. I didn't manage in the speed of everything that happened to say, I do think I've dealt with it well, I'm content with that, can't do much about the rest, I won't take any notice of it. It was that I didn't have the knack of doing.
You need to be on your brief. It's the message I always give to women, that don't have an area of intellectual weakness, make sure you have intellectual strength, and then it seems to me your voice is heard.
And were there any brushes with the media? Clearly the media would have been on your case, should we say, locally, but nationally. Any bad moments with the media?
I learned to do media during the London mayoral campaign. I mean, I had never done a television interview before I was the candidate. So, you know, it was learning by fire or trial by fire. And I think you develop that degree of exposure that came with that first campaign, the number of interviews. You just have to get on with it and learn how to do it. I don't think the media were negative because I was a woman. You certainly got attacked by the media because you were a Liberal Democrat. I mean, I listened to interviewers, like somebody like Andrew Neil gives everybody a hard time, but because he's somebody who has no time for the Liberal Democrats, I mean, the level of scathing attack was something you pretty much had to be prepared for. So I think I got attacked much more because I was a Liberal Democrat, and that did not suit those who were interviewing me, rather than because I was a woman.
Keith Joseph came along and he introduced family income supplement. This was helping poor people in work, because this was the trouble, and the trade unions weren't going to help them. So my father sent him the pamphlet. I used to write articles for The Guardian. He sent me a pamphlet I'd written about poverty and budgeting behaviour of poor people. And so he was wonderful, and he said, well, but you know, this is very good work. I was only about 23, and it's really good work. But the thing is, you have to remember, it's much easier to divide the cake up than it is to bake it in the first place. And so that really made me a conservative. Whatever you do, you've got to create the wealth. Anyway, on we go, and I'm in Parliament. And Keith used to come up to me and say things, that's a nice dress you're wearing, Virginia. Now, I was maddened, but he meant it politely. And I would say, well, that's a nice tie you're wearing. So you had to learn not to be mean, but to use humour. And I say this to people as women as a headhunter. You get awful patronising comments, but the thing is, don't get mad, get ahead. And if I might, another absolutely ridiculous story. When I was first the MP in South West Surrey, I was asked to give away the prizes at a school, Priorsfield, posh girls' school. And it was a school that had a male chairman of the governors. The tradition was the head girl's father thanked the visiting speaker, and it had a headmaster. So they introduced me. They say, "Oh, we're so pleased Mrs. Peter Bottomley is here to give away our prizes. Mrs. Bottomley is married to Peter Bottomley, the transport minister," and on we go, talking about Peter for a long time. And now Mrs. Bottomley will give the prizes. So I then, off I went, saying how pleased I was to be at the school. And then I managed to say, and how fortunate we were in this country that Mrs. Dennis Thatcher was our Prime Minister, to which, house collapses. But I always say to women, don't get nasty, get witty. And that was a good response.
Was it like a male public school? What was the feel of Westminster like? Because there were those 101 Labour women 18%, I think, of Parliament at that time. But it's hard for you to say it's a different feel. But did you reach out to the Labour women at all?
Well, I would no idea what a male public school was like, and I heard people say that, but I'm state educated. It's not a point of reference for me. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had worked for 15 years in agriculture, and that is a male-dominated profession for sure. But I always felt as a young woman, very respected, and I'd been given quite a lot of responsibility. As a young graduate out of university, I handled a £200 million contract for sugar beet in this country. So it was quite a shock to me to find a culture where clearly men were dominant, and there was quite a bit of misogyny. That was pretty evident very early on. And so indeed, you tend to sort of reach out to other women your own age. Sometimes I didn't get a very friendly reception because sometimes when new MPs arrive at Westminster, they assume that the battle they've just come from of fighting people in other parties, is what you carry on. I think it takes them a while to realise you can have friends in other parties. And I did make friends in other parties, and men and women. And typically we were the ones who'd be in the library, trying to keep ourselves awake till late at night, trying to get through all the paperwork so that we wouldn't be taking that back home, so that we would have more time to spend with our family at the weekend. And we became firm friends, and we're still friends today.
And did that misogyny display itself in the hours? Because there was the women in particular led the reform of hours, didn't they?
Well, that was one aspect of it. I don't think it was so much just men, who were resistant to the idea of changing the hours. I think parliamentarians that had got used to the long hours culture and the overnight sittings and quite liked it, I think. That was where the resistance came from to changing to earlier finish, I think, generally. No, the misogyny took, some quite harsh forms. I remember the very day that I was signing up, you have to sign your name and then you swear in. And somebody who would remain nameless was standing behind me and said, what do you even think you're doing here? You should be at home looking after your children. And I was pretty taken aback by that, because I had never really encountered that in the workplace that I had been in before I came into Parliament.
And that was someone from your own party, the Conservative?
Well, I'm not going to say who it was, but it was that sort of thing was said on more than one occasion, because my children were quite young. But the dilemma for women candidates is if you leave it too late, and it was actually very helpfully women parliamentarians who were mentoring us as candidates said, don't leave it too late, till you've had your family, till they've completed their schooling, because you'll find then you'll be regarded as too old to go into Parliament.
I think I'm most proud in politics of having won a marginal seat 3 times. It was very, very, very hard work, really, really hard work. And I like to think that personally I made a contribution to those very small majorities as well as Labour. I don't know whether that's true or not, but and I never lost it, and that was important to me. I never lost the seat. I stood down. And the thing as a minister, I think, was bringing a bit of common sense about what schools and education was like into the policy making of that Labour government. So I was surrounded by clever people, surrounded by good politicians, and I was the voice that said it might be better if you did this or did that. And sometimes I think I was good at highlighting issues that needed to be dealt with that others wouldn't have seen. But policy-wise, the reform of the teaching profession was something which that was my best bit of policy. And when I go in schools, I can still see it there. So, and half proud is, I don't know, I suppose I need to make an assessment of how well I've kept to my own values and what I wanted to achieve. And like anybody who gets to my age, it will be tried hard, got some things right, but not everything. And that'll do me.
If you care about things, you do horrible things. So there's a sweet man, Geoffrey Rivette, who wrote a history of the NHS. I like this a lot. And he said Virginia Bottomley made all the decisions her predecessors were too cowardly to make, and for which her successors should be eternally grateful, which is very nice. But essentially, I really mind about the health service. And you had all these hospitals, and rather like Tesco, you had to go to superstores and corner shops, and you just couldn't have all the duplication. And I'm completely from the medical mafia. And the other critical thing was, Oxford and Cambridge, Southampton, they have the health service and the university are integrated. But in London, it was necessary to sort of integrate the major teaching hospitals better with the big universities. So it's very touching. You know, the rector of Imperial kept writing to me, Ron Oxborough, saying, thank goodness you made those decisions, Virginia, because this has enabled us to make progress. So I didn't mind getting a kicking. I mean, I didn't like it, but I never had a judicial review against me because these had to be done. So if you take Barts, for example, of course, people thought I'd come in particularly to shut Barts. Of course not. My grandfather trained at Barts, but there isn't a population there. So St George's Hospital used to be at Hyde Park Corner. It's now in Tooting. And Barts had to go out to the East End, where the population need is. A huge hospital there. So it wasn't pleasant, but it had to be done. And there was a wonderful moment when the chairman of the North East Health Authority, the chairman of Barts, and somebody else, all generals and admirals came to see me and said, Secretary of State, if you resign from the plan over Barts, we'll all resign. So I didn't like the idea of being cowardly in the line of fire. And so we kept on with it. And there were times when John Major had meetings of the heads of the Royal College with myself, and he'd say to them, they'd all say, oh yes, Virginia's completely right about the need to have fewer, better hospitals, completely right. But of course they didn't want to stand up and say so in public. So I'm proud of what I did, but it was tough. And it was tough on my children. So my daughter was a junior doctor. And people were, she was at Guy's and Thomas's, and there was no protection from the press. And the press were always wandering around the wards. But the switchboard were very sweet. So they would say, when they say, is Dr. Bottomley here? They would sort of say, Guy's. No, we think she's at Thomas's. And when she was the other way, when she was at Thomas's, no, we think she's at Guy's.
I have to say one of my best achievements in government was rough sleeping and reducing that by over 2/3 in just over 2 years. But I worked with Tessa on Sure Start and on the priorities in Sure Start, and I picked that up again when I became Social Exclusion Minister. So when I became Social Exclusion Minister, I went back to why is it that we haven't closed the gap for the most disadvantaged? We'd done very well with the next group up, who'd got into Sure Start, who'd got into tax credits, who'd got into skill training. But the very bottom, we hadn't really shifted. And that was one of my jobs as Social Exclusion Minister. But on Sure Start and on early years intervention, I was able to do loads. And on Sure Start, I was able to maintain, even though there had been a proposal to stop it, that there would be a health worker involved in every Sure Start. because actually, if you're going to identify who are the most vulnerable families when the children are first born, you need the health visitor. You need the midwife, you need somebody from the health department. And I was able to succeed with the Department of Education that they had to keep a health worker in there.
One of the things that really struck me after I became an MP was the difficulty that many women had in going back to work once they'd got children. So I remember one speech I gave in the House of Commons, which I'm sure is still in Hansard somewhere, where I reported on the experience of one of my constituents. There's a woman called Nicola, and she was a scientist too. And she had worked, she had children, she continued to work with the support of her partner. But when the relationship broke down and he left, she suddenly realised that she couldn't afford to work anymore because she couldn't afford the childcare. And in the end, I made representations both through Harriet Harman, who was a very willing listener to all this, and she spoke to Gordon Brown as well, and I kept bringing it up in speeches. It's absolutely absurd that we have this situation in Cambridge where people advertise jobs and they simply don't get applicants because none of the women can manage to do the jobs because they're all looking after their children. And so what we need is more childcare, provided childcare at a cost that people can afford. And then we could get more women back into the workplace, which is where women want to be. You know, I mean, being at home looking after children can be very satisfying, but it's not for everybody. And to see all these well-qualified women who weren't able to go back into work when local industries were just crying out for well-qualified employees, it just seemed to be utterly absurd.
I'm really proud of beating the BNP. I am really proud of Sure Start and the childcare and Every Child Matters. I was the first ever children's minister, so I'm really proud of those big things. I'm really proud of stuff I've done in Barking, Dagenham. You know, from I got a hospital. You know, I saved a hospital. I got a birthing unit open so babies can be born in Barking again, which is very important for social cohesion. I mean, tons of stuff I've done there. I'm really proud of the work I've done around tax, trying to raise the issues around fair taxation, that everybody should pay according to their means into the common pot for the common good. I'm really proud of the work I'm doing around dirty money now. So I am actually, in an odd way, relieved, whether I'm proud of that we expelled anti-Semitism from the heart of the Labour Party, and we did it so quickly. So there's all those things I'm really, there's a lot. And actually going right back, one of the things that has really stood the test of time is I was chair of housing in Islington in the 1970s, and we built the biggest housing programme in the whole country. And you now look back, I still live there, and I think, God, the housing stock's not bad. And a lot of that is because of what we did in the 70s. It has stood the test of time. What hasn't stood the test of time, which is so depressing, is Sure Start. Because when we set up the Sure Start centres, I literally, as children's minister, remember going round the country speaking at conferences, saying, this is the new frontier of the welfare state. And I never, ever, ever imagined that it could be so quickly destroyed and undermined. So those things I'm proud. The thing that I regret the most is actually a pre-government thing, which is, again, when I was leader of Islington, and there was this emergence of a scandal about child abuse in children's homes. And I mean, at the time, I took all the right advice from, you know, we had the police investigate, we had the social service investigate, and God knows who was lying to us, but they all told me there was nothing in it. What I really regret is we didn't talk to the children. And this is 1970s, when it's a very different era. But had we talked to the children, we'd have got a very different story. And in fact, the social service director, I'll never forget, sitting in the room with me, saying, you don't believe those children, Margaret, they're naughty children. And that's a 1970s attitude. But my regret is that I only wish I talked to the children. That's a real lesson I took from that experience.
I had a background in international agricultural politics, and I am a linguist, and there was to be a meeting of environment ministers 20 years on from the original Earth Summit in Rio. But there was a vacuum as to what the summit 20 years on should try to achieve. So as an environment minister, I sort of looked around the world for what could be the next big idea for environment. And I discovered there was a Colombian environment minister and an academic who had worked out something called Sustainable Development Goals. Now, today we know what that means, but back then nobody had any idea what that was about. I remember meeting her and hearing her talk through really profoundly what that could achieve as a successor to the Millennium Development Goals. Not least because Sustainable Development Goals are universal. Every country has SDGs. MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, were designed to help the world's poorest countries. So the interesting thing was, I met with resistance to SDGs from ministers in development departments in other parts of the world. But with a lot of talking and persuading, actually we succeeded in Rio in getting unanimous agreement for the SDGs. And for me, that's something I'm very proud of.
As a minister, I was able to come in and prevent the destruction of the programme that we had in place to support the development of electric vehicles and electric transport. It relied on a system of grants. I went out to the States, saw how effectively things were being done there, came back with a new programme and was able to engage with Treasury and get funding which was about to be withdrawn and which frankly would have left us in a situation where even dreaming about having an electric vehicle industry would have been impossible. So I happened to be at a place at the right moment to do that. But I mean, mine were not earth-shattering, life-changing achievements. I recognise that. And so, I mean, I have great admiration for one of my colleagues, Lynn Featherstone, without whom equal marriage would not have happened. Now, I mean, now there is something to go away and put on your tombstone.
It's the team effort.
It was a team effort, but that is a case, and I think a very clear one, that where an individual absolutely made the critical difference. It was not a collective decision. It was one person championing an issue and bringing other people in across the parties and across both houses to come in and provide support, obviously with the help of a very effective civil service as well. But sometimes the individual is pivotal. I'm not sure I've ever played that role. I'd hoped to do it in two areas, and there just wasn't enough time. I mean, our bus network, which is such a nightmare, I really think we wanted to drive changes. I wanted a commission in place. We'd sort of agreed on the structure of it, but I would have had to be re-elected and we'd have to have continued in coalition for me to be able to do anything with it. So, there are moments like that. And also, I suppose where I did make some difference is in two things that are much smaller, but one of them very important, and that was to try and change the culture of transport to be much more open to people with disability. It seemed to me we were doing that incredibly badly. Again, I had some ideas and had some projects which never came to fruition, but we did get a cultural change, I think, in many of the transport companies.
And there's one improvement, and I always look back on this one, which I think really transformed women's life in the community, and that was the right to request flexible working. So there were a bunch of us who thought it was really important. We were ministers, so you had that. But again, we worked collaboratively as ministers. And then there were some women in number 10 as well, 2 women who were working to Tony Blair at that time, we were all absolutely determined to get this right to request flexible working in. And both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were very resistant to it because they thought that the business community would hate it. But this sustained pressure from Parliament, from government, from the officials supporting, the political officials supporting Tony in number 10. Eventually we won. We brought it in, and I honestly think that in terms of women balancing their lives between work and their caring responsibilities, it's been the most important change that we effected, which has really helped women both stay in the workplace and carry out their caring responsibilities. I think it's been more successful than I ever thought.
Social media has become poisonous and is contaminating politics. So again, in our day, if they wanted to write to me, and my goodness, they did write in Southwest Surrey, but they had to write a letter, buy a stamp, financial penalty, put it in the postbox, and then wait for the reply. Now they have a gin and tonic in the evening and immediately tell you what they really think. And there are a lot of crazy people around, and I think the vilification a lot of these women have come under, I just wish they would take no notice, get off it, how easy it is said than done. And it has become quite a dangerous place. It was quite dangerous in my day. I used to have, people would sort of say, well, you know about mental health, don't you, Mrs. Bottomley? And I'm mentally ill, and can I talk to you about it, when I was on a train? And you got no protection. PTUs get protection because the IRA were always after him. But I didn't get protection, and I got all these crazy letters, somebody knocking on my door and saying, oh, Mrs. I'm just waiting to know I'm going back to the psychiatric hospital. I wanted to come and see you first. You know, really pretty scary stuff. No protection. But it's not the sort of insidious nastiness of this trolling, which I've not had.
Oh, I think it's terrible now for some women in social media. Political women get absolutely trashed in social media. And I think it is a real issue that nobody knows how to deal with. And that's partly that you have men isolated on their computers, being fed really bad stuff, and they can get away with writing things because they think nobody will ever find out. And it's, you know, it's bad for them. They are not having whole lives, but it is very, very frightening for the women. And when I talk, because I still spend a good bit of time talking to women MPs, and when you hear what they're having to put up with, I'm really pleased. I left just as social media was becoming big. And it's one of the reasons I left. I said to my constituency, I would be a nightmare if I was on Twitter all the time. It's time for me to go, because any MP is going to have to do it in the future. So, you know, that's one of the reasons I think it's time for me to say goodbye.
The abuse that comes through social media is just intolerable, and that needs to be fixed, because, you know, you're not going to get reasonable, decent people to stand of any gender while that is going on. It's just not.
And do you think there needs to be more reforms for social media? You know, you pioneered new technology.
Yeah.
But is there something now that needs to be done to make it more manageable?
I think, yes, better regulation possibly, but the companies themselves need to take action to stop the abuse. The abuse is, I mean, what social media is ideal for is reasoned argument. So I never mind talking to people who have different views, but I do mind being abused, and I think most women would feel that too.
I think it's awful what women, all MPs and the women in particular, are going through today. I just hope that if I was in politics now, I'd have learnt some of the skills of social media, so I wouldn't be the person I am now going into that milieu. But I did, and I found that very difficult. I remember the head teacher of my two nieces' school being phoned when I was 12. I remember the people took. I don't have a partner or children of my own. I remember turning up at the corner of my mum and dad's house, and that is nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what happens today. Absolutely nothing, and I didn't like it. And I remember Alistair saying to me when I resigned, he says, "In a way, you're a bit of an old-fashioned politician." I did sort of know what he meant about that Yeah, that was the beginning of, I think I was an MP during the beginning of politician as celebrity, and it didn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with me now. But I was absolutely, don't forget, when I became an MP, we weren't doing emails. Becoming a minister in 97, on the whole, it was still written letters. It's that far back, 97. So it was a different world. We didn't have social media. But now, I do think we've got to do something about it. I don't know what. But we won't. The only people we'll attract to politics, if we don't do something about it, is those who can shrug it all off and got thick skins and don't listen and can't hear. It's absolutely, whoever you are, you need a private life. You need space to breathe and spaces to walk along, not being fearful of who's standing there with a camera. I take my hats off to some of my colleagues for how they're dealing with what they have these days.
I had death threats. I had threats to kill me, to kill my children, to burn our house down. And I just thought, after 22 years of loyal service to my constituents, I just thought that it was time to go. And actually what's been rather nice since retiring as an MP is some people in my constituency have come up to me and apologised for what they wrote and what they said. And that's been quite a healing, actually. But yeah, the abuse was incredible. And I hadn't experienced anything as bad as that throughout my parliamentary career.
Did you get extra police protection?
Yes, we had police protection, but it not just for me. I mean, I was at Westminster Monday to Thursday. My daughter was at home on her own, and she too had to face the threat. That some of these threats to kill had been directed to her. You know, she had to be taught to look, you know, with a mirror under the car before she drove off, and to live like this. This is no way to live. And I think that, you know, hopefully as a nation we can pull back from the consequences of a social media that's out of control.
I had my first death threat in 1976. So again, when I was in local government, and some guy threatened to kill me with an axe in those days. The police came to the door and told me there's guys after you. And I thought, oh, blimey. And then shut the door, and that was it. The police never came back again. So what I did was take up smoking, having given up smoking a month before, which was terrible. But so it's always been with me. And I think what you have to do, and it is a skill I've developed, it's not you, it's not me they're really talking about. You know, they've no idea who the real you is. It's a sort of, you represent something, so it's not personal. You've got to understand it's not personal. And then you have to compartmentalise it. So I think, you know, which I did learn to do, because I've had abuse down the years, and if I hadn't learned that, I think I wouldn't have survived. So it's not you, it's not the real you, it's what you represent to them with all the challenges they may have. Put it into a box. Don't obsess with it. I just don't, every now and then I look at it and think, oh God, pathetic. But get on, if you want to change the life, make the world a better place. One of the great ways of doing that, not the only way, but one of the great ways of doing it is through politics.
I have never really engaged with social media. When I was an MP, Twitter, now it's X, was it first appeared. And in those early days, obviously, as a Member of Parliament seeking to communicate with constituents, I used it extensively, but it was very benign. Trolling was not something you'd heard of. And then just before I lost my seat, at the very end there, suddenly the tone on it changed, and I would get messages basically saying things like, "Oh, tell us who's being embarrassing now," or "What bad story can you tell us?" And what you know, that's in the early days, it was more just almost a neutral communications issue. So I'm very sensitive to the fact that a number of women that I know find it quite hard to take the level of poison that comes at them on social media. But I decided when I lost my seat, if there had to be a benefit to losing, was that I needn't continue with social media. And what finally made the decision for me was, unintentionally, but friends or family friends of my children started posting photographs of my grandchildren on social media. And I think that my feeling was that put them at risk and exposed them in a way that I couldn't control. And so I decided it was time to come off social media altogether.
I think there is misogyny directed towards women. If I speak to other women at the top of their professions who are in the public eye, they would say they too attract incredible abuse via social media. And I think we need to get a grip of this, because these are things that you can't write to people because they would be libelous. These aren't things that you could say to someone face to face because it would be criminal. But just because you can think you can have your anonymity, to tap out a message to somebody and to escape the normal defences that are in place against that kind of abuse in society, I think that shows me that there's a gap in the way we handle social media.
I would advise women of any age to go into politics. I do think that the life experience that one has shapes a lot of ideas and decision making. I'm not saying all women are good, all men are bad. I'm saying that we need that mix. We need that variety, and I think we need the variety by age. I would say to many women, politics is a very consuming career. You are a public figure. I mean, when I was an MP, when I sat down on the bus, invariably someone would sit next to me with a set of queries. When my husband, who was alive then, when we went out to dinner, people would bring their chairs, sit down at our table with us to query us. If we went to the theatre, people would wait to the intermission to then come and ask a series of questions. When my husband died, people brought casework to the funeral because they thought I won't be holding a surgery that week. And their issue was so important it needed to be drawn immediately to my attention. I can tell you it shocked the vicar no end. So that is a difficult life, I think, for your family.
Dehumanising.
It is. What is so frustrating about it is that you have people that are described, and then you have other people who hold back from approaching you because they feel you must be busy, and so they shouldn't possibly disturb you with their problem. And you want to say, but yours is exactly the problem I want to deal with, because you've got a real problem. So it's a very frustrating process. But I would say, I think it's tough if you've got a young family and young children. I wouldn't say to anybody, don't do it. I'd just say, be prepared for the fact that you will need a lot of support and a lot of resources. Parliament never used to provide them. I don't know if it's better at that now. But you really do need those kinds of resources, I think, for anyone with a young family. And typically, the people who carry most of the strain with a young family are still going to be the women, and so they need far more support. When you're older, and frankly, as you get older, you get thicker skinned, you get a whole lot tougher. Then I think politics is a really exciting place to go. And it is a place where you're bringing that life experience that you've been through. And I do think we need that in politics, not just young people.
Politics is important. If we don't do it, someone else will do it. If people say, well, I'm not going to go into politics, it won't stop. It won't continue to listen to you. You've got to be there to influence the game. And suppose if you go into politics, you are by nature someone who believes that things can change. You don't go into politics unless you want to change something. And I suspect that the next generation coming through, one of the things that will be in their mind, it's really funny, one of the things that was in my mind was I'd like to change the way politics is done. But in my day, that was a different agenda. When they go into politics now and say, I'd like to change the way that politics is done, it will in part be about social media.
When you're reading individuals' personal letters, when you're listening to their interviews and their voices, what you get, which is often lacking in the official records, is the emotion of what it felt like that, why it mattered to them, what they particularly enjoyed, conversely, what they found particularly challenging. All of that is going to come out in the personal material much more than in the official, inevitably.
I think I have had the most interesting, privileged, productive, exciting, uplifting, difficult, challenging professional life that you could imagine for.
What the Groundbreakers project does for us, I think, is to take us into the digital age. As we look to the future, more and more people are going to be accessing our resources online. And we want our material to be used in the classroom at all sorts of different levels. And I think audio-visual material is a really good, engaging way of doing that. People want to see these individuals talking about their experiences. They want to hear it from them in their own voice.